Comments on items not on the agenda? Why? Any comments from the public on things that are not on tonight's agenda? Okay, well, then I guess at this point, we have a public hearing. Similar use application SU 2023-01. Amid Myra of Myra Homes Inc. for Koya Auto Company located at 785 East 3rd. We'll open the hearing. And as a result of that, good evening. I need to read something into the record so that, you know, it's official and all that. So good evening. My name is Ron Kerr. I'm the Planning Commission Chair, and I'll be presiding over tonight's hearing. The public hearing is now open. This is the time and place set for the public hearing in the matter of case number SU 2023-01, a similar use determination regarding commercial uses on the ground floor with the residential use on the upper floors in the commercial core C district at 785 East 3rd Street. Oregon land use law requires several items to be read into the record at the beginning of each public hearing. The city planner will read the material. Your patience is appreciated as the statements are read and we take care of these housekeeping matters.
Thank you. The applicable criteria upon which this case will be decided is found in the Lafayette Municipal Code, section 3.10804 for similar use. The specific criteria are listed in the staff report and will be summarized during this hearing. Testimony, arguments, and evidence must be directed toward the criteria or other criteria in the plan or land use regulation which you believe to apply to the decision. Failure to raise an issue accompanied by statements or evidence sufficient to afford the decision maker and the parties an opportunity to respond to the issue precludes appeal to the Oregon Land Use Board of Appeals based on that issue. Failure of the applicant to raise constitutional or other issues relating to proposed conditions of approval with sufficient specificity to allow the decision makers to respond to the issue precludes an action for damages in circuit court. For the parties, if you have any documents, maps, or letters that you wish to have considered by this body, they must be formally placed in the record of this proceeding. To do that, either before or after you speak, please leave the material with the recorder who will make sure your evidence is identified and placed in the record. The hearing will proceed with the staff report, followed by the applicant and those in support of the application. Then the opponents will be allowed to testify. Then those who are neither in favor or against the application. The commissioners and staff may question the applicant and testifiers. The applicant will be given an opportunity to rebut the testimony or evidence. Prior to the conclusion of the hearing, any participant may request an opportunity to present additional evidence or testimony regarding the application. If such a request is made, it will be up to this body to determine if the hearing will be continued to a time and date certain, or if the record will be kept open for submission of written evidence or testimony. If the record is kept open, it will be for a minimum of 7 days, with a short rebuttal period thereafter afforded to the parties and to the applicant.
Thank you. Okay, I need to ask the audience, are there any objections to the notice that was sent out in this case? So let it be known, no objections. Are there any objections to the jurisdiction of the commission to hear and decide in this case? Again, public comment? No. Okay, for the commissioners. Yes. Are there any declarations of ex parte contact, bias, or conflicts of interest by any members of the commission? For myself, answer would be no.
No.
No. Nope.
Okay, we are now ready for the staff report. Thank you in advance, Jim.
Thank you again. So the staff report has been available to you for the last week, and it has the usual information about the applicant, the owner of the property, and what the request is. So on one page, first page of the staff report, just so we're clear on the request, it's a similar use application requesting the planning commission determine if the proposed use is similar to the allowed use in the commercial core C1 district. The allowed use is commercial uses on the bottom floor, for example, retail stores, restaurants, business services, and offices, with second or upper story apartments. And the location is on the east end of town, 785 East 3rd Street. The site size, there's two lots. One is almost 1 acre. One is a little over 1 acre. The zoning is C1 Commercial Core District, the city's downtown central business district. Existing development on the front parcel is a existing used car lot with a building for an office. And the lot in the back is developed with a detached single family dwelling. So I'm going to skip a little bit because adjacent zoning and land uses are not necessarily important for this request. And there's a vicinity map at the bottom of page 2. And then on the next page, there's an air photo that's a little more of a close-up with Highway 99 or 3rd Street on the top to the north. And then the used car lot on the front lot and the single family dwelling on the rear lot. And then at the bottom of page 3 is where it starts about the review criteria. And the criteria for this similar use application is that for use ambiguities, and this is a case where the applicant contends that the listing of a permitted use, the one we're going to be talking about, is ambiguous. And that's where a similar use may be authorized, provided the applicant demonstrates the proposed use satisfies the following criteria. The use is substantially similar to a permitted or conditional use in the underlying zoning district and is similar in character, scale, and performance to permitted or conditional uses in the underlying zoning district. And so then the finding for that criterion basically starts at the bottom of 3, goes over onto page 4 and 5, and in the at the very bottom of page 3 is the issue tonight. There's in the C1 district a lot of commercial uses, offices, restaurants, retail, all those typical kinds of commercial uses. And then another permitted use is, quote, second or upper story apartments. And the code section there is listed. So we're talking about second or upper story apartments. The applicant contends that that allows some residential use on the bottom floor. And so the issue is, does that language, those 5 words, do they say that you can have residential uses on the first floor? The staff report and through the findings concludes that no, it doesn't. And the way these are looked at is kind of a 3-step. First is, and this is from numerous decisions at the Oregon Land Use Board of Appeals, and when issues like this are at the Oregon Court of Appeals or the Oregon Supreme Court or even the U.S. Supreme Court, the courts all start out with, what does the phrase say on its face? So on its face, it says second or upper story apartments are allowed. The analysis is, where in those 5 words does it say that residential uses are allowed on the first floor? Well, it doesn't. And when you're interpreting, you can't put words into a phrase that aren't there, and you can't take words out of a phrase that are in the phrase. So we're dealing with what it says on its face. In the middle of page 4, there's a italicized and indented quote, but I'm not going to talk about that. I'm going to the next paragraph that says, but the use, quote, second or upper story apartments, end quote, does not state, nor does it intimate that the bottom floor can be any use that is part of or accessory to the apartment on the upper floors. So the entirety of the bottom floor must be commercial uses. The list of permitted uses allows a lot of different commercial uses. And then the second and upper floors are limited to residential. So the conclusion is, based on the above, the C1 district does not allow residences or accessory residential uses such as garages, laundry rooms, home offices, etc., on the bottom commercial floor. Therefore, the proposed bottom floor garages, which are in the applicant's materials, which are accessory to the upper floor residential use, are not similar to the allowed use, which is only commercial uses on the bottom floor. At the bottom of page 4, there's some additional discussion, and that goes into the context of the C1 district. And so when you're at the Oregon Land Use Board of Appeals or at the Oregon Court of Appeals or the Oregon Supreme Court, they'll say, okay, if on its face it's not clear, what is the context? In some cases, the context can provide some direction as to how the language should be interpreted. And so basically, because on its face, it's clear that the language does not allow residential on the first floor. I'm not going to go into all this contextual information other than to summarize it by saying all the standards in the C1 district are oriented toward commercial on the first floor. And there's nothing in here that talks about residential on the first floor. So the context of the C1 district supports the conclusion that commercial uses are on the first floor and residential uses can only be on the second or upper floors. Moving on to page 7 then, the staff recommendation is that the commercial core district does not, recommends the commission interpret the language in the C1 district to not allow residential uses or accessory uses to a second or upper floor residential use on the bottom floor, and recommends the planning commission pass an oral motion directing staff to prepare a planning commission order denying similar use request. So with that, I will end the summary of the staff report, and if you have questions, I can entertain those so that we can go on to the applicant's testimony.
I have no questions of you, Jim. John, do you have any questions?
Only question is, how does someone on the second floor get to their apartment if you can't have anything to do with their residential up the floor down below? So access. to that.
Parking. Parking is the thing. If you got parking.
I'm telling you, just a little walkway up,
Okay, walkway.
Yeah,
because that would be a door facing, say, the street or the parking area, whatever it is.
typically,
That's not written in.
typically it would be a staircase outside.
Yeah.
So that people don't have to walk through the commercial area to get upstairs to where they live. Because the first floor would be leased out to a business, and typically businesses don't appreciate or want miscellaneous people that live upstairs walking through the business to go home and get out and go to work.
I just wanted to ask the question, so I didn't
Yeah.
see it in the report.
Yeah, and as I was starting to allude to, I had a comment, but before I share my comment, Doreen, do you have anything you want to share?
I feel that the staff report is, I mean, I agree with it. It seems pretty clear to me.
Okay, and of
that,
course,
that residential is not permitted on the first floor.
correct. And I tend to, yeah, the staff report is very clear. While I'm not trying to bring any of the proposed information in, if I do look at the proposed information and I tie in, at least in part, to Don's comment with regard to the residents accessing their units through an outside entrance, I can see that, but most people are going to have and park at least one vehicle somewhere, which then if the ground floor is for commercial and residents must be above, then even looking at the proposal, part of it is there is parking at least in one area that is underneath the residential that is above, while parking for the commercial use would be acceptable. Residential parking in that commercial space, if you will, could even be interpreted as, no, that's a residential use of the first floor, so that creates a problem. And then when you start it, then that means you gotta provide the residential parking in some place in such a way that it is not associated with any kind of ground floor use. Basically, if there's an apartment above, then you'd have commercial space below it. The only way you would have parking is if you don't have any residential space above it, so you could say, hey, that ground parking is nothing but a mix of commercial and residential parking. That would change their plans potentially and entirely. And my perspective from staff reports in this is twofold. I'll circle back to that because in spite of I do want to hear what the applicant has to say, if that's all right. I do want to hear what they have to say, and those that might be in support or those might be, because this is going to be fair to them. And it might also be I think it will be in Lafayette's best interest to do that as well. So on that note, is the applicant here?
Yes.
We don't have a podium, but
Sit over there.
you can sit over there. You can stay where you're at. Just state your name and address for the record. That's fine. And we'll go from there.
Sure, my name is Omid Mira, I'm the applicant, and this is Behzad, he's the owner of the property. And I guess I'll jump right in. We've been sort of, obviously there's two tax lots. And we're gonna phase it in such a way that he can afford to build this thing, so that's the reason why we're phasing it and we're doing the detached units in the back first, so then he can sell those hopefully or rent those and then afford to build what is allowed in the C1 very clearly with commercial facing Highway 99 and then residential apartments on top with parking behind. With that said, first of all, this rear lot is C1, but it's an anomaly. Basically, that's the only lot that doesn't face Highway 99 and it's C1. All the other ones that are C1 are facing Highway 99. So it's not a typical situation and it won't be seen from Highway 99. So in a sense, it's a transitional lot, even though it is really C1. So I understand that. So the way that we've sort of set this up is that clearly we have parking for the upper, residential on the ground floor. But there's two rows of buildings basically that face a kind of access street. But first row is actually coming off of Highway 99 and it uses the driveway of the RV park. And on that side, which is the side that you come into this development, the commercial faces that street. So the parking is behind it.
Correct.
So the parking is not, so in a sense, that is commercial facing the access into the property. Then on the other side, which obviously has parking in front, we do have access from the outside to the commercial that's in the back. Granted, I was told at some point that look at the sizes, the minimum sizes of what is considered as commercial. I looked through the code, there is no minimum size and there is different uses. So you can have like small offices, attorney offices, various kinds of things that don't require, thousands of square feet for commercial use. So we ended up basically doing these smaller units in the back, commercial spaces in the back that could either be used to be rented out to people, and it has access from the outside. It's not only access from the inside, on both sides. They clearly are set up so that they can be accessed from the outside. And then they can also be accessed from the upstairs unit, but there's a hallway, there's a separation between the two. And with that said, the idea was that we definitely have commercial on the ground floor of those units. It's not residential only on the ground floor. If anything, there is no residential on the ground floor of those units. Plus, for the commercial space, there is one parking space required. So we have two areas that there is actually one per unit of commercial parking space for both sides. So I believe there was 14 units or something. So there's 14 parking spaces separate from the ones that are underneath the units. So for the one that faces the RV park, it's a parallel parking, so it's right in front of the commercial. And for the ones that are behind it, they are going to be basically on the north side of the interior sort of access street. So with that said, we felt that we're providing the commercial needed for the parking needed for the commercial. We're providing the commercial. Granted, it's not one big grand commercial space, but it's smaller units, which the code seems to allow. And any which way you do it, there's going to have to be parking for residential. So for the fact that we have garages for the units, that was going to have to be needed regardless of what residential unit we put on top. There was going to have to be parking underneath. So we feel that this actually does fit into what the code allows for C1. And I'm more than happy to answer any questions you might have.
Right, and you hit, in that respect, you hit the nail on the head in the sense that you are going to have sufficient parking for both commercial demand. You're going to have sufficient parking for residential demand. So that ups your space. But it also gets back to how the code reads. And the code reads commercial below, residential up top, even residential parking underneath hints at residential as opposed to not. So
I guess my question
Yeah.
is for the allowable scheme, basically, the one that the portion that would be the second phase, which would be facing Highway 99. We're going to have commercial in the front facing Highway 99
Yes.
and parking behind. So I'm just wondering, how's that then? Again, we have parking behind commercial. So what if we have commercial and you have to have the mix of the two, right?
You're right. And I guess what I'm getting at is the way our code is written, and why I'm kind of bringing this up is the way our code is written. It kind of to me, it says you have residential on the top, you have commercial down below. Yes, you can have commercial parking down below, but that means there'll be nothing above it. Which all of a sudden, that means the way that property is developed is you've got your commercial residential, and then you've got your parking. However, yes, Jim.
Well, this isn't about commercial in the front and parking behind.
Correct. It's about
So that's.
location.
Spot on.
It's about commercial location. The whole point is,
The point is, the language says residential on second and upper floors. And residential includes anything that's accessory to the residence, such as a laundry room, parking, a home office. And a home office is an office for the homeowner or the
Yes,
rental.
so that's what I say, parking,
Have their
parking
own
under, parking, any
office.
parking underneath their, their structure
Yeah, so
would not be.
we need to not be distracted by a discussion of commercial in front with parking in back.
No,
because
right.
that's what
I
we're
know,
not
all I was
talking
getting at by the commercial in front, the parking is back, is with the commercial in front, the parking. As long as that parking in back, that parking has no residential over it, thus resulting in residential parking underneath it. You don't violate that. And I'm saying that residential parking underneath the structure itself puts it in what would be considered the commercial zone. To me, that means, and I want to get, let me ask, are there any other supporters here for this? And yes, we know you're in support. If you have anything you want to comment on from the support.
Yeah.
Okay, is there anybody here against? No, and then neither for nor against, judging by audience, there's not. What I'm getting at by my comments is based upon what we've got, staff report, I think it will be advisable to close the hearing. We can still deliberate about it.
I might ask if they have any concluding comments.
Okay, any concluding comments? Okay. So I'll close the hearing then, if that's all right. And then from a planning commission deliberation, I want to put the idea out there that when it comes to our code, this particular application, when it comes to parking, residence, commercial mix, to make a good use of not this property, but any property in the C1 district, this applicant has shown that there is a weakness to me in our code, and we need to visit that. I really think we do, because if anybody is living in a unit, an apartment that's overhead, they've got to park somewhere, whether it's a garage that's enclosed or underneath the structure. We need to have a way that our code can allow that mix of commercial and residential in a way that makes sense from those three competing interests of residential, commercial, and then everybody, the vast majority of people drive. So if we say residential parking underneath the residential structure where you have commercial would not be allowed, then we need to revisit our code and make it, yes.
Our code doesn't say that or regulate it that way. If you have first floor commercial and second and upper floor residential, the parking for that can be anywhere on the site except on the first floor. It can be just open air parking off to the side or behind.
Yes.
It can be off to the side or behind in a garage or in a carport. So parking for the residences is not limited by the current code language. What is limited is the ground floor, where you have second or upper story residences, has to be commercial.
Right, and all I'm saying is maybe we need to look at our code, so some ancillary use of residential is allowed in that area, such that you could have a garage and a walk up and still have good commercial space. So you have a good balance and a good mix. That's all I'm getting at. It makes better use of land as well. Because now you don't have to say, well, for this parking, we now got to take and have this space over here, either off-street parking. You're going to have parking, so put the parking where it can blend in and a better balance. Yes.
Well, our code allows that.
No, a better balance where the
Any kind
parking-
of residential on the first floor then you're taking a limited resource. Commercial space
Exactly.
is not easily found and it's not easily created. Our code says, or the language recognizes that and says first floor in the C1 zone or downtown kind of central business district zone says first floor. Okay, that's valuable stuff for commercial. We want it to be commercial. We don't want to start nibbling away at it and saying, well, yeah, you can have half of the first floor commercial and the other half can be non-commercial. That's taking away a limited resource. And this commercial land that we have isn't going to get any bigger as the city grows from 4,000 to 5, 6, 7, 8,000.
Go ahead.
Wouldn't it make more sense to then rezone the area to then allow residential parking in garages on the first floor? Because then you don't have to change the actual zoning, you don't have to change the code. If it's C1, it's C1, and that's why there's all these different layers.
Then you potentially go to what's called, what is it, RC.
RC, yeah.
RC.
Like a mixed use, like.
So that,
yeah.
because yeah, Jim's right. You know, you've only got a certain amount of space that is commercial or commercial. But if no matter what, you're going to have parking, you're going to take up space and real estate for parking. So what's the difference if it's in one chunk somewhere and versus a little bit in somewhere and a little bit on that first floor level? You're still going to take out of that total lot size, you're still going to cover a certain percentage of it with parking. You guys, and by having some resident, at least having the parking and a walk-up attached with the apartment, it actually makes the apartment more valuable. And if you happen to have somebody that is, let's say, an accountant that prepares taxes, their home offices suddenly could become, oh, they've got that small, maybe it's in that location, that thing, as they pointed it, as you know, it's a small office. Maybe it's one person. Yes, their home is above, but now they're also leasing the commercial space for their business practice. And it makes more value from a demand standpoint to balance those
It
three.
takes away space.
But it does not take away space.
Commercial space on the first floor is valuable. Commercial space on a second floor is not as valuable. And the higher up you go, I mean, that's why you don't see very many
But you're
situations.
still gonna have parking on that lot somewhere, and that space taken away.
And have the parking de-emphasized, have it wherever it fits, but keep this limited resource, the commercial space on the first floor. That's why in downtown areas, even smaller downtown areas, you have commercial on the first floor, residential on upper floors, and the parking is wherever it fits. The parking is not the most important. Having those square feet of commercial land for lease is what is the most important in the C1 district.
Then you want to push the parking, you even want to push the parking off that lot entirely.
Well, our code doesn't do that, so we don't need to worry about that.
I'm talking.
We can't take any comments, right?
Correct.
Okay.
Yeah, the hearing is closed. Thank you. So all I'm saying is that there's something here that I think is.
I would say if you start to change, if you're changing your C1 definition, then that could happen anywhere on Third Street that there's C1. So then you could maybe not have a commercial retailer, say a clothing store, and that becomes someone's garage on Third Street. And I think the city doesn't want, they want to keep as much C1 as C1 permanently, and that's why it was designed that way. But also there's an opportunity to rezone. It's always a possibility. I can't say that's the best thing to do, but
there would be a.
because what you're talking about is the R C1 or
I
whatever.
believe what is would be the resident, it would be a residential commercial use of that. So you could have residential, we have commercial, you have both.
Is that what would fill your tax accountant portion? It's their residency, also it's their business. That would be residential commercial. That's not
Right.
C1, and that's not what C1
And you would,
is designed for.
yeah, and you have that specific, in that specific spot in that RC, you can still have your residential, however mixed, and you can still have that one physical space considered commercial and leased out as a commercial, totally separate from the residence.
Right, but the way it's set up is first floor commercial in the dark red area, C1. That's the whole point. That's our downtown central business district. And over the years, the concept is that's important. That's our downtown. And it may not all right now be filled up with commercial buildings and that sort of development pattern, but we need it for the future. In 1990 to 2000, our population doubled. From 2000 to 2010, during the recession, it increased 45%. That's crazy fast growth. From 2010 to 2020, we went up 18% more when we were trying to get over the recession, and ended up at the end of that 10-year period with a pandemic. And so making a decision now that would chip away at saving the first floor for commercial uses is not what you want to do. We've got the plan set, we've got the zoning set, the concept is there. Why would we chip away and say, well, it's okay to have some residential related uses on the valuable first floor where normally it's commercial lease space?
Question.
I agree with Jim.
Okay,
First floor always means ground level.
correct.
So if parking's a big issue, you always go below. Just a thought.
So.
And that would be consistent with the current language, which says the first floor would have the commercial uses, and
So-
then the point of the meeting tonight, residential on second and upper floors.
So then in order to do the parking, then you would, instead of having the parking on the ground level, you would create a level below that.
And that could be residential.
That could be
parking.
residential parking and or business parking. So in effect, yeah, okay. And so, yeah,
And by looking at the plans, you could modify them. I mean, me looking at the lot, there is plenty of room for parking not below the residential. To me, I see this big open spot here.
and then some of that big areas, that areas that you just put circles on to closest to you,
Oh, is that,
represents going, it would be a steep area that's
That's right.
unbuildable. As it is.
I forgot about that.
Yeah, and because the issue is the language in the code, again, looking at the site plan and the pages and pages that were provided tends to distract us from the issue, which is what the code says. Residential only on the second and upper floors.
Is anybody ready to make a motion?
I'm ready to make a motion.
Go for it.
I move the planning commission to deny the application, adopt the staff report, and direct staff to prepare a planning commission order denying the application.
All in
I
favor?
second that.
Okay, it's been seconded. All in favor? Aye.
Aye.
Okay. Motion so carries. Thank you, gentlemen.
So with that said, if we want to expand the business that's there now, is that allowed? Or is that also something that is not allowed?
The used car lot is a non-conforming use. the C1 district does not allow used car lots. And so you would not be able to expand it, but you can certainly continue the non-conforming use for as long as you want to have it there.
Yes.
Okay.
Okay, next item on the agenda.
Old business,
Okay.
any old business?
Oh, actually, I will, if that is okay. At the city council meeting, planning commission member George Larson was removed. The city council held a continuance of the prior meeting's public hearing. And Mr. Larson, was asked to attend, received letter, signed the letter of return mail. And he was voted to be removed from the council, so he's no longer planning commissioner,
Okay,
so.
old business.
And that was George.
George
Yes,
Larson.
Mr. Larson, yes. So now currently have, we'll have 2 vacancies then on the commission. So.
Okay. New business. Any new business, Jim?
New business, there is right now a open period during the month of March where the annual, it used to be every 2 years, but now it's every year, cities and counties in Oregon can apply to the Oregon Department of Transportation and the Department of Land Conservation and Development for what are called Transportation and Growth Management Grant Funds. One thing that can be done with those grant funds is update a transportation system plan. And because we have had growth for 30 years with no update of our transportation system plan, and particularly the 238 lots, I think it is, up at the north end of town. That's way at the edge of town, and there aren't too many people that are probably driving to work by going north toward Carlton. They're probably mostly coming down through town on Bridge Street and trying to filter through the grid street system in the old part of town to get wherever they need to go and get to an intersection with 99W where they won't have to wait very long to either turn right or left or just go straight across. But anyway, so we have done the initial step, which is mainly just filling out a quickie form, electronically submitting it to the ODOT/DLCD Transportation and Growth Management folks saying, we think when the grant application period opens in May, that we will be applying for a TSP update. The time from the end of March to the middle of May gives the state folks time to look at each one of these letters, call up the city or the city planner and say, you turned in a letter. We see the description of what you want to do is limited to 1,000 characters. If you go 1,001 characters, it won't.
We want to update our transportation plan. Thank you.
It's like a tweet, you gotta just make sure you write it 11.
Yeah, so they call you up and say, okay, what do you want to do? And kind of as a reminder, they say, well, you know, this money is to do X, Y, and Z. And so also, if you have some unique thing that a local government might want to try or have incorporated into their TSP, then you mention that. And generally they say, oh, that sounds like a great idea, because to them, any idea from the local level has to be a great idea from the state level, because they don't intend to shut things down that are great ideas from the local level. But one of the things that I need to do a little more discussion with Brandon and others is the southeast corner of the city, the gray area. The 48 acres of zone of industrial zoning. That land was in the city limits before the Oregon planning program came along. And then as the city did its first comprehensive plan in the late 70s and early 80s, and then did their zoning and everything, that 48 acres, along with another piece or two, was designated in the comprehensive plan map for industry. And then it was zoned in the zone map for industry. And so for 45 years, nothing's happened. And the old farmer that used to own it hasn't owned it for half a dozen years because he died. And so the heirs have had a good number of years to figure out what they want to do with it. And I've not talked to any of them specifically, but it appears that the industrial zoning, there just aren't companies looking for 48 acres out here in Lafayette. And so potentially that 48 acres could be redesignated on the comprehensive plan map and rezoned on the zone map to one of our existing residential zones or commercial zone, or we could create a brand new zone and have some kind of mixed residential commercial neighborhood built. And if you're going to do that, one of the questions would be, well, how is that going to affect the transportation and the trips generated and all that? So if we could have our TSP look at that possibility and do some trip generation projections, then that would help us if we or the property owners ever want to switch out of an industrial zone into some kind of residential, commercial, or mixed use zoning.
Yeah, and one thing that would have to be looked at, all of the industrial lots that are up there.
Now, there's only about 3 or 4.
You have a railroad track cross, and it's my understanding from even going back several years, various planning commission meetings, that the reason that's probably not been developed, particularly in recent history, like the last 20 years, for an industrial site, you're going to want to get heavy trucks in and out. Those heavy trucks in and out, there are certain federal and state requirements to go across the railroad tracks as far as distances and spaces and widths and traffic, control arms. And they can only go in certain locations. And if you look at the 2 existing access points that come off of 99 Southwest Locks Loop, it ties in way out to the east of 99 and goes across and ties in just inside the city limits on Highway 99. Neither one of those locations would have sufficient space to put in everything that would be required for heavy trucks. So, and all the property that's off of what's going out of town, Madison turns into Lafayette Highway, that's going straight through residential. That would not work because either the roads are too small or the property, in one case, the road stops and then there's property. So that creates issues. So if that industrial land needs truck access, then that should be taken, where it could be located should be taken into account in the transportation plan, so that if one loses the ability to have truck access, railroad in the right location, then the usefulness of that particular property it's going to be more confined.
And that's why Jim mentioned kind of talking to a few people.
Yes.
Because I know, without giving out too much information, I know there's possibilities from both the industrial side, possibly long-term, or residential. But I think any change to that intended use would have to come voluntarily from the property owner, most likely. But, that talking to Setcor and talking about that property, that's probably one of the biggest industrial zone properties in the area. But like Jim said, how many industrial companies are looking for mid-size 47 acres? They want to either go gigantic or they want to do small industrial manufacturing, which, but then you have the lagoon there, you have the railroad tracks. So there's a lot of discussion needs to happen between myself, Jim, the rest of staff, and the ownership to see what's going to happen with that, because looking at the map, that's the biggest piece of the map that's undedicated. So,
Right, so yeah,
I mean, most cities, even small cities, had sometimes as long ago as 100 years ago, they had an industrial base. They had a flour mill, they had a lumber mill, they had something that was industrial. And there's even the remnants of it left over to, today. And in Lafayette, there was no such industrial base ever. There were, I'm sure, a few very small industrial companies, but there's no big grain silos sitting by the railroad track. There's no anything sitting by the railroad track where, like most cities, even just in Yamhill County, the railroad tracks, oh yeah, there's that big old grain elevator.
and if I remember history right from my being out and at the Yamhill Locks Park, before the railroad came into town, Lafayette was
the head of navigation.
was the prominent city in Yamhill County relative to McMinnville. And part of that was because the locks were there and it was river transportation. So that was fine. And then once the railroad came in, for whatever reason, the railroad came in, this site was not considered attractive for what the railroad needed. 4 miles down the line was teeny tiny McMinnville. It was ideally suited. So that's how then growth shifted from Lafayette to McMinnville, but that's in the 1800s.
Well, the original county seat was Lafayette. And apparently it's in some way, shape or form, the county records were moved over to McMinnville. And as soon as that happened, that solidified McMinnville as a place to be. Any county seat is a place that typically grows and gets bigger and bigger. And so as soon as the county records left Lafayette, then Lafayette took a big hit economically. And that was in 1857 or something, way before any railroad was even considered for this area.
So that railroad
Lafayette, just ended up not having much here and never did in terms of an industrial base. And so that land for the last 40 years has been sitting there. And for many of those years, apparently it was not a big deal because the farmer was a farmer and he didn't want to sell it and have it developed while he was alive. And so now that he has passed on, his heirs are the owners, and even they have not been able to figure out what they want to do with it. I'm aware that they have, 4 or 5 years ago, contacted one of the big planning, engineering, consulting firms in downtown Portland and asked them some questions about what might this land be best used for. And I thought that, okay, then we're going to end up getting the zone change, comp plan map changes. They're going to want to do something there like Villebois in Wilsonville. And so nothing's happened. I don't know what's going on, but nothing's happened. So assuming that something will happen, and I might mention that even though it may be the largest industrial zone land in one ownership in North Yamhill County, it doesn't have good access, partially because of the railroad, but also partially because it's not on the main 99 or Highway 18. And so 18-wheelers, they want to be able to get off the main road right away into their industrial location and not be driving 2 or 3 miles on the old 99 to get to a small town and pull into a property in a small town. So just kind of as an item to try to work into the TSP work. And I think the state would recognize it as, yeah, why has the city not rezoned that already? And of course, it's because we're waiting for the property owner to say something about what they would prefer to do. But anyway, we'll see about getting that in the TSP. And it won't be a matter of the TSP is designed for that. The TSP will cover what it needs to cover. And then I'm envisioning there'll be an appendix or an extra several pages in the TSP addressing this property in the event that it were to change to a use that would generate a whole lot more trips in an industrial zone. Then we'll have that information in the TSP.
So potential TSP update coming down the pipe here sometime during this year.
Yeah.
Hopefully, yeah.
Well, and it's a competitive thing, so just because we apply doesn't mean we'll get it, but hopefully we will,
Okay,
because we think we deserve it.
fair enough. Might as well try. Next meeting, April 20th. Okay. Yeah. So do I,
And for our new planning commission people, we might try to have a little reminder, I don't know in what form, but to set aside the third Thursday of every month,
yes,
because they have a commitment the third Thursday of every month. And certainly we recognize that people get sick and have work-related things and other reasons to miss a meeting. But we just need to kind of keep in the back of our mind that the third Thursday of every month is a planning commission meeting.
well, I've got it on my calendar.
Mine's up the next.
Okay, do I have a motion?
I had a motion to end tonight's meeting.
I second that.
All in favor?
I
Aye. We'll head towards home then.
Thank you, Doreen.
Doreen,
Thank you
don't,
guys.
don't-
Sorry I can't be there in person.
safe commute on your way home, Doreen. Don't trip over the dog.
Exactly. Take care, you guys.
You too.